Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight, wherever you are and however your day has unfolded. If you haven't already, this is a good moment to dim the lights, to pull the blankets a little closer, and to let your body begin to find its way towards stillness. There is nothing you need to do from this moment on, no decision waiting for your attention, no task that cannot wait until morning. Tonight, you are simply here to rest, and everything else can be set aside for a little while. Over the next hour or so, you will hear for stories, real stories shared anonymously on Japanese online forums by ordinary people trying to make sense of their lives, translated slowly and carefully into English for an audience settling in for the night. These are the kinds of things that people in Japan write late in the evening when something has been sitting quietly in their chest for too long. Accounts of workplace tension, of family dynamics that didn't work out the way anyone hoped, of small moments between people who cared for each other but struggled to find the words. They move slowly, the way real life tends to move when you are honest with yourself about it, and they do not ask anything from you except a little patience and a willingness to listen. The narration has been shaped with the help of AI, and it has been paced deliberately to allow your mind to wander, not to keep up with every sentence, but to let the sound and the rhythm carry you somewhere quieter than where you started. You do not need to follow every detail or hold on to every name, and if a passage drifts past you before you quite catch it, that is not only acceptable but perhaps exactly what this is for. Some listeners hear all four stories through, and others are asleep long before the second one ends, and both of those are entirely fine outcomes, welcome outcomes even. So take a breath that is a little slower than the last one, let your shoulders drop, and allow the voice to become something ambient rather than something to chase. For quiet stories from Japan, for a long and restful night. Let's begin. Somewhere in the layered and humming expanse of the city, where streets narrowed between apartment buildings and the light of convenience stores spilled onto wet evening pavement, there lived a man named Kazuichi, who was 30 years old and had grown, without entirely meaning to, comfortable in his solitude. His mornings followed a familiar sequence: the alarm, the shower, the small breakfast eaten standing at the kitchen counter, and his evenings were a mirror image of his mornings, a return to the same rooms, the same silence, a kind of winding down that began the moment he stepped through his own door. Many nights he would stand at the window of his apartment for a few minutes, not looking at anything in particular, simply watching the city's lights settle over the rooftops and listening to the sound of a train moving somewhere in the middle distance, its passage like a slow exhale across the dark. Salarymen, as a category of person, were often described in the same terms: reliable, unremarkable, devoted to the regular orbit of work and rest, and Kazuichi would have agreed, without any great embarrassment, that he was a fairly average example of the type. Now and then he would meet his colleagues for drinks at a place near the station, and in earlier years these evenings had been lively enough, full of talk about department gossip or the newest person who had joined the floor, but lately the conversation had drifted, almost without anyone deciding it, toward topics that did not quite include him. His colleagues talked about children now, the specific weight of a sleeping toddler in one's arms, the logistics of a weekend trip to an aquarium, the cost of preschool applications in the better neighborhoods, and Kazuichi would listen with genuine warmth, nodding in the right places, while feeling, just slightly, like a man reading a letter addressed to someone else. He was not unhappy, he would have said if asked, simply aware of a certain distance between his own daily life and the lives that were accumulating, visibly and with evidence, around him. He had been in relationships twice, once briefly in high school, once for a little longer during university, and both of those had ended with the gentle friction of two people who wanted different things, and he had carried no bitterness from either, only a vague sense that romance was something other people were perhaps better suited for than he was. The years since university had passed without a great deal of event, at least in the personal sense. There had been promotions, transfers to different floors, a handful of meals at good restaurants with people he liked, and a few illnesses that kept him in bed watching old films on his laptop. He was, in his own words on the nights he thought about it, a person of unremarkable face and unremarkable manner, someone who occupied his share of the world without drawing much attention from it, and this had never seemed, until the conversations at the bar began to change, like a problem worth addressing. What he did not tell his colleagues, and what he was in the habit of mentioning to no one, was that he had a single talent which surprised people when they discovered it, which was that he cooked, and he cooked with real skill and care. The kitchen of his apartment was the most carefully tended space in the whole place, the knives clean and ordered, the pantry organized, the little jars of dried herbs arranged by the frequency with which he reached for them, and in the evenings after dinner he sometimes sat for a few minutes with a cup of tea and felt, in that space, something close to contentment. He had learned to cook in high school, out of a combination of curiosity and the particular satisfaction of making something with his hands, and had discovered quickly that it was a thing he could do without effort that others found difficult, which gave him a quiet and entirely private pleasure for years. But he had also learned, through experience, that mentioning this habit to others tended to invite a certain kind of comment, the good-natured teasing that implied cooking was not quite a proper interest for a man of his generation, and so he had stopped mentioning it, and the skill had become, over time, a secret kept only from the people around him. December arrived that year the way it usually did in the city, with a sharpening of the air, a shortening of the daylight hours, and the sudden appearance of illuminated decorations strung between the buildings of the shopping district, which Kazuichi would notice in passing without stopping to look at them for long. He had a particular relationship with the end of the year that no one else entirely understood, which was that he looked forward to it, not to any social occasion or celebration, but to the private project of cooking the traditional New Year's foods entirely alone, for himself, over the course of several quiet days. One Saturday afternoon in the early part of that December, his phone rang with his mother's name on the screen, and he answered in the unhurried manner of someone who was not expecting anything in particular from the call. His mother's voice had a quality he had always associated with home, warm but efficient, direct without quite being blunt, and she moved through the pleasantries in the easy way of a person who has already decided what she intends to say before picking up the phone. She asked him to come back for the New Year holiday because, she said, there was something she wanted to discuss, and he recognized in the phrasing a certain deliberate vagueness that suggested the topic was one she preferred to raise in person. He had not been home for several years, not because the distance was great, an hour's drive on a clear morning, but because he had grown accustomed to spending the New Year season on his own, and the tradition of it had quietly calcified into something he was reluctant to give up. He looked forward each year to those particular days between the 28th of December and the 2nd of January, when the streets grew quieter and the television aired long special programs, and he would spread his cooking across several unhurried afternoons, working at his own pace without interruption. The lacquered box, the jubako, his grandmother's three-tiered one that came out from the back of the cabinet once a year and only once, was the centerpiece of this project, and he would fill each compartment with food he had made himself, the sweet rolled omelette, the black soybeans glazed with sugar and soy, the fish cakes and the vinegared vegetables, each dish requiring its own preparation over the course of 2 or 3 days. It was, he would have admitted, an unusual way for a single man in his 30s to spend his winter break, but the pleasure of it was genuine and entirely unashamed, even if no one else ever tasted the result, and the satisfaction of completing each compartment felt like a small, complete, and sufficient accomplishment. This year he agreed to go home, and on the day of his departure he loaded the finished jubako carefully into the back of his car, along with a bag of clothes and a jar of the soba broth he had made the day before, intending to cook the actual noodles at his parents' kitchen on the evening of the 31st. The drive was pleasant in the thin winter light, the road running between fields that had gone to pale gold stubble, with the occasional outline of mountains visible in the far distance, and he arrived at his parents' house in the early afternoon, the familiar sound of the gate's latch under his hand exactly as he remembered it. His mother's expression when she saw the jubako was the expression he had expected and perhaps quietly hoped for, a mixture of genuine surprise and the particular warmth that parents reserve for children who do something unexpectedly well, and she carried it to the kitchen with a care that told him she intended to serve it properly. They ate together that evening, the three of them, his father, his mother, and Kazuichi, at the low table in the room that still had its tatami floor and the old cabinet that had been there since his childhood, and the meal was quiet in the way that comfortable family meals are quiet, with pauses that neither party felt any obligation to fill. After the dishes had been cleared away and his father had excused himself to watch the evening news from the other room, his mother settled back at the table with her tea and assumed the particular expression he recognized as the one that preceded a significant statement. She observed that he was now 30 years old, which he confirmed, and she mentioned that a childhood acquaintance of his, a girl who had grown up in one of the houses down the road, had recently married, and there was a gentle emphasis on the word recently that carried its meaning without requiring her to spell it out. She said that she thought it was time for him to consider the same thing, and Kazuichi, who had seen the shape of this conversation arriving for the last several minutes, replied that being told to get married did not, in practice, make the process any simpler. His mother laughed at this, briefly, and then said that she had not raised the topic without some kind of plan in mind, and she asked whether he had ever given any thought to an omiyai, an arranged introduction, the kind of meeting where two people are brought together by family or intermediary for the explicit and openly acknowledged purpose of considering marriage. He had not expected that specific suggestion, he admitted to himself, and he sat with the idea for a moment while his mother poured more tea, the room warm and smelling of the food they had eaten, the murmur of his father's television program a soft sound from the adjoining wall. She told him, with a certain satisfaction that she made no effort to conceal, that she had already identified several possible candidates, and he asked whether that was not perhaps moving rather quickly, to which she replied that things moved as quickly as they needed to, and that she had been quietly preparing this for some time. He asked, with the mild reluctance of a man who already suspects the answer, whether he might at least be told something about whoever she had in mind, and she declined entirely, saying that there was more romance in knowing nothing beforehand, which was a position he found philosophically unconvincing but had no energy to argue against. When he pressed her a little further, she relented and offered the single piece of information that his prospective match was 32 years old, and he sat with this for a moment, turned it over once, decided it told him essentially nothing useful, and concluded the evening by agreeing, with the slightly helpless acquiescence of a man who has recognized that the outcome is already settled, that he would go. The remaining days of the holiday passed in their ordinary way, his father's television programs, his mother moving through the kitchen in the mornings, the jubaka appearing on the table at mealtimes and being quietly appreciated, and when he drove back to the city at the end of it he felt, without entirely being able to account for it, something that was not quite anticipation but was not quite nothing either. He did not mention the omiyai to his colleagues when he returned to work, though he thought about it during the longer and quieter stretches of the afternoon, turning the idea over with the mild curiosity of someone who has been handed a sealed envelope and told not to open it yet. His mother's message, when it finally arrived, came on a Thursday evening as he was finishing the washing up after dinner, and its contents were brief. The date had been set for that coming weekend. The venue was a restaurant with private dining rooms, and he was to dress accordingly. He spent a few minutes in front of his wardrobe, which was not a deep wardrobe and did not take long to survey, and selected the dark suit he wore to formal occasions, and a tie that had been given to him by his aunt on some forgotten birthday, and a shirt that was clean and free of creases. The restaurant was in a quieter section of the city, the kind of establishment that did not need large signage to announce itself, with a wooden door and a small lantern above the entrance and, inside, the sound of very soft music and the smell of lacquer and good things being cooked somewhere beyond the front room. His mother was waiting near the entrance when he arrived, her expression carefully composed in the way that parents' expressions become composed when they are trying not to give something away, and she told him that the other party had already arrived and was waiting in the private room. He followed her down a corridor lined with low wooden panels and a small alcove that held a single flower arrangement, white chrysanthemums in a narrow celadon vase, their stems straight, their petals very still, and she stopped before a sliding door and looked at him once before she drew it open. The room was small and lit softly, with a low lacquered table and cushion set on a wooden floor and a view through a narrow window of an enclosed garden where a stone lantern stood among a patch of moss, and at the far side of the table, sitting with her hands resting quietly in her lap, was a woman who was not at all what he had expected. She had long dark hair that fell simply past her shoulders, and a stillness about her that was not coldness. It was more like the kind of composure that belongs to people who have grown accustomed to being looked at and have decided, somewhere along the way, not to be altered by the experience. She was beautiful in a way that was not startling so much as genuinely unexpected in this particular context, and Kazuichi felt a sudden and complete self-consciousness that he had not experienced in many years, a brief interior rearrangement as his understanding of the room adjusted itself to include her. He introduced himself as he sat, his own name coming out steadily enough despite the fact that some part of his mind was occupied with an entirely separate process, and she replied with her own name, Yomeko, in a voice that was low and carefully measured, and said that she was pleased to meet him. The two mothers sat for a time, filling the first several minutes with the kind of gracious conversation that serves to let both parties settle, and Kazuichi was quietly grateful for the presence of his mother's voice nearby, which gave him something familiar to orient toward while he recovered his composure. When the mothers eventually made their quiet exit, saying that they would leave the two of them to talk, with the easy air of people who have arranged exactly this and are entirely satisfied with the arrangement, the room felt at once both smaller and more expansive. Yomeko was 32, she explained, and worked in an office in the city, and her hobbies were reading and walking, long walks, she said, the kind that go without a fixed destination, simply to be outside and moving through the world at one's own pace. She was not, she clarified, someone who particularly enjoyed the kinds of social evenings that required a great deal of noise and performance. She preferred quieter places, smaller gatherings, conversations that were allowed to slow down and find their own rhythm rather than being carried along by the energy of the room. He found this, unexpectedly, extremely easy to understand, and he told her something of himself in return, the work, the apartment, the general shape of his ordinary days, and though he did not mention the cooking, he found himself paying attention to her responses in a way that told him he was genuinely interested in what she thought. She listened in the way that certain people listen, with a quality of attention that made the speaker feel that whatever they were saying was worth the time it took to say it, and he noticed this without quite naming it, only registering a general ease that had not been present a quarter of an hour before. At some point in the quieter part of the conversation, he asked her, carefully, he hoped, without prying, why she had come to this kind of arrangement, when he imagined, he said, that she had many other avenues available to her if she wanted them. She smiled at this, a small smile with something behind it that he could not quite read, and said only that her past relationships had not tended to last very long, and that she found herself here more or less by the logic of the situation, which was not, she acknowledged, the most poetic explanation she could offer. He felt, in the way she answered, that there was more to the story than she was offering at that moment, and also that pressing further was not the right thing to do, so he let the thread rest where it had landed and moved gently on to something else. They talked about books for a time. She read a particular kind of slow and atmospheric Japanese fiction that he admitted he had never tried, though he could see the appeal, and then about the city, and about the way winter changed the feeling of streets that were otherwise entirely familiar in every other season. The food arrived at intervals, carried by a server who moved quietly and did not linger at the table, and they ate with the comfortable rhythm of two people who have discovered, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they are not finding the evening as difficult as they had perhaps anticipated. He noticed that she ate with an unhurried pleasure, not performing enjoyment but genuinely present in it, the way a person is when they are not simultaneously thinking about the impression they are making, and he found this, in some way he could not have explained, reassuring. As the evening moved toward its natural close, the tea arriving, the conversation growing reflective rather than exploratory, she said, simply and without ceremony, that she had found the evening pleasant, and he said that he had as well, which was entirely true. They agreed, with the slightly careful manner of two people still being courteous with one another, to meet again in 3 days, a dinner after work, somewhere simple, no occasion required, and when he said good night at the door of the restaurant his breath fogged in the cold air and the street beyond was very quiet. He sat in the car for a moment without starting the engine, the windows beginning to mist very slowly at their edges, and he was aware of a feeling that was not quite anything he could name but pointed, at its edges, in the direction of wanting to see her again. The 3 days between the OMI and the next meeting passed with a quality he had not experienced in some time. Each morning felt slightly more purposeful than the one before, and the work that had always been simply work seemed to complete itself more readily, as though his attention had, without quite deciding to, sharpened. His colleagues noticed, in the way colleagues notice things without saying them directly, that something about him seemed different, and one of them asked about it with a raised eyebrow across the desk, and Kazuichi said only that he had been sleeping well, which was not entirely untrue. He spent one evening reading about restaurants near the station where they had agreed to meet, not because he needed to research it in any particular depth, but because doing so gave him something to occupy his hands while his thoughts moved elsewhere, and he settled on an Italian place that a colleague had recommended some months ago. He tried not to think too much, or told himself to try, about what the future shape of things might be. It was too early, and the territory was still entirely unfamiliar, and he had learned from his earlier years that mapping the future with too much eagerness was a way of setting expectations that the actual future was under no obligation to fulfill. Instead, he moved through those 3 days with a kind of measured attentiveness, doing what needed doing, eating his own cooking in the quiet of the kitchen in the evenings, watching the city through the window before he went to bed, noticing that the quality of his own stillness had shifted slightly without becoming unsteady. On the third evening he took the train to the meeting place and arrived perhaps 5 minutes early, which was unusual for him, and stood on the pavement outside the station watching the stream of people moving past in both directions, their coats dark against the winter night. She came around the corner at a slight hurry, moving with a small and quick grace that he had not quite anticipated, and seeing him she adjusted her pace to something calmer, and when she was close enough he could see that she had dressed with care, though not elaborately, and that she seemed, he thought, a little nervous. He said that he had not been waiting long, which was true, and they walked together to the restaurant through streets that were quiet at that hour, their footsteps easy on the damp pavement, the sound of the city softening around them as they moved away from the main road. Inside the restaurant the light was warm and the tables were set close together in the way of Italian restaurants in the city, and they ordered the kind of meal that takes time, pasta and bread and wine that arrived in a small carafe because neither of them particularly wanted a whole bottle. The conversation that evening moved differently than it had 3 nights before. It was less careful, less exploratory, and there were moments when one of them would say something and the other would respond in a way that suggested they had been thinking along similar lines, which was unexpected and, without either of them remarking on it, pleasant. She laughed at something he said, a real laugh, not the polite variety, and the sound of it in that small warm room was like something gently opening. By the time they left the restaurant the evening had grown later than either of them had quite accounted for, and the air outside was sharp and still, and they stood on the pavement for a moment in an easy quiet, deciding by some unspoken agreement whether to go on somewhere else or to let the evening rest where it was. They decided, by mutual gentle movement in the direction of the station, that the evening was complete, and they walked back together slowly, not hurrying, the street quiet around them, and at the station entrance they said good night with a formality that was just slightly less formal than it had been the last time. He had not said anything that evening about seeing her again, nor had she, but the question of whether there would be a third meeting did not feel, to him, like a question that needed asking. He rode the train home through the city's lit interior, the station sliding past one after another, the carriage rocking gently in its familiar way, and he thought about the evening, not in a dissecting manner, not turning it over to examine its pieces, but simply in the way you turn a good and unforced thing over to see all its surfaces before setting it down. Back in his apartment he made a pot of tea and stood in the kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being in the space that was his, in the way that one stands in a familiar room after something has shifted slightly in the world outside it. He thought about the way she had listened, and about the small details she had offered about herself, the walks without destinations, the preference for quiet rooms, the reading she did in the late hours when the apartment was entirely still, and he felt that these were things he understood without needing to translate them. He washed his cup before going to bed, a small habit of order he had kept for years without being able to explain exactly why, and turned off the kitchen light, and lay for a while in the dark of his room with the city's distant sound moving through the window he always left open a little. He found himself thinking, in the calm and unfocused way of a person near the edge of sleep, that something had begun, not dramatically, not with any great declaration, but quietly, the way most things that last actually begin, in the ordinary middle of an ordinary evening. The city settled around him as the hour grew later, the traffic on the road outside thinning to the occasional single car, the lights of the neighboring building going dark one window at a time, the sound of the world narrowing to something very close and very small. Kazuichi lay still under the weight of his futon, and his breathing was slow, and the night was cold in the comfortable way that winter nights are cold when you are inside and covered and there is nowhere you need to be until morning. And that, for now, is where we will leave him, in the quiet of his own room, at the beginning of something that had not yet found its full shape, on a winter night in a city that held its cold gently and without urgency, as such nights sometimes do when they have no particular reason to rush. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet echoes fading now like breath against cold glass, settling into the dark where stories go when they are finished. There is no hurry. If you need a moment, take one, let your shoulders drop a little further, let the weight of the day release its last small grip. Breathe in slowly, and out even slower. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, to the kind of warmth that lingers long after a person is gone, the way a room still holds the scent of them. Rest easy. It is already finding you. He smiled when he walked in. He always smiled when he walked in. She told him she had been losing her hair, with the same matter-of-fact tone she used when she described most things, the same register she had used when she called to tell him about the overlapping shifts, or the 7 hours on local trains, as though her own discomfort were simply one more piece of information being passed along in good faith. Her hair had been short before, a cut that suited the shape of her face, softly precise, and as it thinned she had started wearing a hat, and when he gave her one on their anniversary she wore it from that day forward with the wholehearted commitment she brought to all the things she loved, wearing it every time he saw her, as naturally as though she had always worn it. A doctor had mentioned to him, during one of the corridor conversations that accumulated over months of regular visits, that this particular illness tended to advance more quickly in younger patients, and he had received this piece of information the way one receives something that has no place yet to go, and stored it somewhere that he did not often visit. She began to ask him to come a little less. She said it the way she said the hard things, compressed into a small space, assembled carefully over time, offered now because it could no longer be withheld. She said she was glad he came, that his arrivals were the best part of her week, but that sitting beside her for hours at a time and watching what the illness was doing to her was a cost she could see him paying, and the watching of it was itself a pain for her, because she loved him and did not want to be the cause of a cost. He understood this, or believed he did, the way love can turn itself outward past its own needs, wanting to remove the beloved from the harm even when the harm is the very thing that makes the beloved present. He kept coming. On Fridays, because Fridays had become theirs, without either of them formally naming it, the one evening in the week that had no other claim on it, the one stretch of time that existed purely as itself, unrequisitioned by other obligations. The nurses had begun to offer him small reports, in the easy conversational way of ward staff who have known both members of a couple for enough months to feel some affection for the arrangement. They would tell him, when he arrived, that she had seemed lighter that day, more talkative, that she had known it was Friday and the knowing of it had done something to her morning. She had apparently told them about him, at some length and with considerable embellishment, delivering episodes from their time together in her characteristic narrative mode, which was more romantic than documentary and more flattering to him than the actual event supported. There was one story they mentioned more than once, a day at a railway station when she had been waiting alone and two young men had approached her, and he had arrived and moved between them, and they had left, and the version she told was considerably more resolute than the version he remembered living, but he understood why she told it that way and was glad for the telling. On an afternoon in that same season, the doctors granted her several hours of supervised leave, not a recovery, not even a temporary reprieve in the medical sense, but a carefully bounded permission, accompanied by a schedule of medications and the stipulation that the outing be brief and gentle. He arranged the day they had been deferring since before any of this, a return to the place where the story between them had had its beginning, the bench before the castle where he had first said what he meant and she had said what she meant in return. Her father waited outside the entrance to the park, at a careful and respectful distance, present enough to be there if needed and far enough away to give them the privacy of the afternoon. They could not ride the attractions, her body was not in a condition for the demands of movement or sensation, and so they walked slowly to the bench, and they sat, and they watched the lights and the moving crowds and the castle doing what castles do in that particular light, and they talked. She told him that she had noticed him first, long before he had noticed her, that she had been the one who asked a mutual friend to arrange the exchange of numbers, because she had wanted to know him and had not been able to find a way to begin on her own. He received this as one receives a piece of information that makes the past suddenly legible, not surprising exactly, but completing, the way the final piece of a pattern makes visible what the earlier pieces had already contained. When the hours they had been permitted drew to their end, she asked him to say again what he had said on that bench the first time, and he did. The words came easily now, without the long hesitation that had preceded them before, and he thought that this was what love did over time, made the words less frightening because the person had already been trusted with them. She said that coming had been worth it. The weeks after that afternoon settled into a different kind of time, quieter, slower, though not in an uncomfortable way. She sat for shorter intervals and lay for longer ones. The conversations grew more spacious, the pauses between sentences longer and softer, and these pauses no longer needed to be filled because both of them had long since stopped needing to prove anything to the other. He sat beside her and held her hand across those visits, and the quality of her grip shifted gradually across the weeks, not disappearing, but becoming lighter, like something that had given back a portion of its weight to wherever weight eventually goes. And in the evenings, with the light outside the hospital window fading from the pale gold of late afternoon into the soft grey that preceded night, and the quiet sounds of the ward settling around them, there was a feeling in that room of something very old, the oldest kind of human thing, the keeping of company in the diminishing hours, the refusal to let a person be alone in the hard work of their going. There is a kind of time that loses its ordinary definition, not passing faster or slower than it should, but becoming thinner somehow, so that the hours, when recalled later, yield less detail than one might expect, the sharp edges dissolved into something gentler and more impressionistic. He would find this later, when he tried to arrange the events of that winter into a coherent sequence, that certain weeks resisted the ordering he attempted, that he could recall the feeling of a day more clearly than its place in the calendar, that memory had chosen to soften the shape of that time into something the mind could move through rather than be stopped by. What he knew with certainty was that he had been there, that he had come on Fridays, and sat in the chair beside her bed, and that she had been herself, still capable of saying something that made him breathe out with surprised warmth, still interested in the small news he carried from the city, still the person who had once arrived windblown and certain after 7 hours on local trains. And for now, for this evening, the story rests here, in that particular hospital room, in that winter light, with the low sounds of the ward moving around them like water around a still place, his hand in hers, the evening coming on outside with the patient unhurry of evenings that carry more than they let on. The rest belongs to another chapter, and another night, and it will keep, the way all necessary things keep, quiet and intact, in the dark. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows folding quietly back into the dark where they belong. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one now, let your breath slow, let your shoulders settle a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The night is long and unhurried, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a quiet patience that took years to ripen, the kind that grows in the spaces between ordinary days, nearly invisible until suddenly it is not. But that can wait just a breath longer. Rest here, at the edge of the next telling, in this soft pause between one world and another. Something had settled into the living room like a low fog moving in off a winter river, something that was neither peace nor understanding, but was at least a pause, a moment in which no one was speaking and no one was moving, and the young man sat on the floor with a folded hand towel pressed against his face and let himself breathe. The room smelled of tatami and of someone's dinner from several hours ago, faint traces of soy and something warmer beneath it, the ordinary domestic smell of an ordinary family home in an ordinary part of the city, a smell that had nothing to do with what was happening inside it. His mother was sitting near the low table, her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders very still, the way a person holds themselves when they have decided not to say anything for a while and are concentrating hard on keeping that decision. His younger brother was sitting a little to one side, slightly behind him, and had said nothing since handing over the towel, which was already warm and damp from use, heavy with the evidence of what the last several minutes had contained. Somewhere outside, the street was moving on without any of them, a soft sound of passing cars in the middle distance, the occasional murmur of a neighbor's television through a shared wall, the world continuing in its slow and indifferent way while the room inside held itself in suspension. The ex-girlfriend's family, her father, her mother, and her brother, were sitting across from him now, arranged on the other side of the low table, and none of them were looking at one another, each face turned slightly inward, each person carrying some version of an expression that had moved past anger and arrived somewhere more complicated. The father's hands were on his knees, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who had made up his mind about something a long time before he arrived at this house and was now finding, perhaps, that the certainty he had carried with him was beginning to feel less certain than it had in the car on the way over. The mother was the one who had been crying most steadily throughout, and she sat with a small handkerchief pressed to the corner of one eye, not weeping openly now but still carrying the red-rimmed look of someone who had been close to tears for most of the evening, her shoulders rounded inward, her posture the posture of a woman who had been worrying for a long and unspecified time. The brother, the one whose energy had driven the worst of the evening, was breathing more slowly now, that energy having passed through him and left him quieter, and he sat with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed somewhere on the floor between himself and the young man, and he had not spoken in several minutes. The young man pressed the towel more gently against his nose and tilted his head back a little, a small involuntary gesture, and thought, with a kind of calm detachment that surprised him, that he would very much like someone to bring him a glass of water. He was aware of pain in several places, but it was the kind of pain that had not yet fully organized itself into specificity, that existed as a general presence, a heaviness along one side of his face, a soreness at his ribs, a looseness in his upper jaw where something felt different than it had that morning. He was aware, too, of something quieter and more internal than pain, which was the sense that his mind was working quite clearly, that even in this bewildering room, surrounded by people who believed something about him that he knew with complete certainty to be untrue, some part of him was thinking methodically and carefully, in the way that minds sometimes do when circumstances become too large for ordinary response. He had stopped asking what he had done, because that question had been answered, and the answer was one that required him to think rather than to react, and he was doing his best to think. What the ex-girlfriend's mother had explained, very carefully and with many pauses, was that her daughter, the young man's former girlfriend, a woman he had not seen in 2 full years, had come to them some weeks ago and told them that she was pregnant, and that the child was his, and that this had happened not through any ordinary sequence of events but through something that had been done to her without her consent. This was what the family believed, or appeared to believe, and it was what had brought them here, to this house, on this ordinary evening, and it was what had preceded the damage to the young man's face that the towel was now absorbing. He had listened to all of this with something that felt, from the inside, like extraordinary calm, though he understood that from the outside it might have appeared as cold indifference, and he had not tried to explain the difference, because there had not yet been a space in which to do so. The young man said, very carefully, that he was sorry to keep returning to the same point, but that he genuinely did not understand, because he and the ex-girlfriend had parted ways 2 years ago, and he had not seen her since, and he wanted to understand, with all sincerity, what they believed had taken place. Her mother spoke in a low and slightly exhausted voice, explaining that her daughter's mood had changed in recent months, that she had grown quieter and more withdrawn, that she had stopped eating properly and had stopped answering her telephone, and that when they had finally brought her to a clinic, the reason had become clear. The young man nodded slowly, absorbing this, and said that he understood how frightening that must have been for all of them, and that he had, in fact, always gotten along well with her mother, had always found her to be kind and reasonable, and that it was strange and painful to be sitting across from her in this particular way. There was a small silence after he said this, and the mother looked at him with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite sympathy, but some uncertain mixture of the two, her handkerchief still pressed to the corner of her eye, her gaze holding his for a moment longer than it had before. He asked, gently and without any sharpness in his voice, whether anyone had spoken with her about when, specifically, this had been said to have taken place, because he felt that this detail mattered, that it was not the kind of thing that could be left unexamined. The brother said, in a voice that still carried some residual heat, that his sister was not the sort of person who would be expected to remember exact dates after experiencing something so frightening, that expecting her to produce a calendar of events was the kind of thing only someone who had something to hide would ask for. The young man considered this for a moment and then said, as quietly as he could manage, that he was not asking in order to create difficulties, but that he was asking because he needed to understand whether there was any period during which such a thing could have taken place, given that he had not, to his knowledge, been anywhere near her in 2 years. The father spoke then, for the first time in several minutes, and his voice had some of the gravel of a man holding back more than he was expressing, saying that the doctor had confirmed the pregnancy was approximately 3 months along, and that this was what they knew. 3 months, the young man repeated softly to himself, turning the number over in his mind, and he asked whether anyone had thought through what that would mean in terms of a timeline, because he thought the timeline was something worth examining together. He said this without urgency, without any edge of triumph in his voice, because he understood that this family was not his adversary in any simple way, that they had come here believing something their daughter had told them, and that somewhere behind all of this, something was happening to their daughter that none of them had fully understood yet. The mother made a small sound and picked up her telephone from the table, and there was a pause while she looked at something on the screen, and then she said that she would call her daughter, that perhaps it would be better to hear things more directly, and the young man said that he thought that would be helpful. He waited, pressing the towel once more to his face, while the mother held the telephone to her ear and spoke in a low voice to someone on the other end, and the room held itself carefully around this small event. The quality of the light had shifted a little, the way interior light sometimes does in the later hours of an evening, settling into something dimmer and more amber as the night outside pressed more fully against the windows, and the room felt smaller than it had an hour ago, warmer in temperature if not in feeling. His mother had still not spoken, but she had moved slightly, adjusting her posture, and he could see from the corner of his eye that her hands were no longer folded in her lap but rested flat on her thighs, which was a small but perceptible change, the kind of shift that suggested something in her had quietly decided to continue waiting. His brother was still sitting slightly behind him, and the young man did not turn to look at him, but he was aware of his presence the way one is aware of a quiet and reliable thing in a familiar room, a lamp that is always lit, a piece of furniture that has always been in the same place. The ex-girlfriend's mother was speaking softly now, listening more than talking, and the conversation on the phone seemed to involve a great deal of silence on her end, punctuated by small sounds of acknowledgement, and this went on for several minutes while everyone else in the room waited without speaking. When she ended the call and set the telephone back on the table, the sound of it touching the surface was very quiet in the room, and she took a breath before she spoke, and what she said was that her daughter had said it was around 9 in the evening, and that the date was probably around the 15th of December, though she was not certain. Probably around the 15th of December, the young man repeated to himself silently, and he felt something settle very quietly inside him, like a small stone finding its way to the bottom of still water, unhurried and without drama. His younger brother made a sound then, a small, soft sound, barely more than a shift of breath, and the young man felt his brother's presence behind him become more alert, more present, in the way that someone leans slightly forward when they recognize something important in what they have just heard. The brother said, in a voice that was even and unhurried, that he was fairly certain he could account for where the young man had been on the evening of the 15th of December, because he had been with him, and that he remembered the evening clearly enough to say so. The room absorbed this for a moment. The ex-girlfriend's brother looked up, his arms still crossed, his expression shifting from something closed and certain to something less certain, the way a familiar wall looks different when the light changes angle and shows dimensions you had not noticed before. The young man's brother said, still in the same even voice, that the two of them had been together that evening, that he remembered it clearly, and that he was happy to describe what they had done if anyone wished to hear it, and he said this without any challenge in his tone, simply as an offer. The ex-girlfriend's father looked at the young man's brother for a long moment and then looked at his wife, and neither of them said anything, and the silence that followed had a different texture than the silences that had come before it, something less certain, something that was beginning, perhaps, to examine itself from the inside. The young man felt very tired, and his face hurt in a steady and persistent way that was not dramatic but simply present, that had been there for some time now and was not going anywhere, and he thought that what he would most like was for this room to quiet itself and for everyone in it to take a long and slow breath together. He found himself thinking about the ex-girlfriend, not with anger, which surprised him a little, but with something closer to sadness, a kind of wearied recognition that something had gone wrong for her somewhere in the time since they had said goodbye to each other, and that whatever that thing was, it was large enough to have produced this room, this evening, these people sitting across from him with their certainty and their grief and their slowly shifting expressions. He had, by his own account, always been on good terms with her family during the time they were together, and her mother in particular had been kind to him, the sort of woman who remembered small preferences, who asked after things a person had mentioned only once, who made tea without being asked when the weather turned cold outside. It was strange to sit across from her now, to see the red rims of her eyes and the tiredness in the line of her shoulders, and to know that the thing connecting them in this moment was a story that he understood, with complete and unshakable clarity, to be untrue. He did not know why the story existed, did not know what had happened in the 2 years since they had separated, could not account for the space between those 2 points in time, and he understood that this accounting was perhaps not his to perform, even as he understood that the not knowing was uncomfortable in a way he would carry with him for some time. The ex-girlfriend's mother asked the young man's brother a few questions in a low voice, and he answered them plainly and without embellishment, and the more he spoke, the quieter the other side of the room became, until the room was very quiet indeed. The father sat with his hands still on his knees, but the tension that had been in his knuckles earlier had begun to ease, and he was looking at the low table now rather than at the young man, which was a different kind of looking, the kind that happens when a person is no longer looking at an adversary but simply looking at a surface while thinking. The young man's mother, who had been silent for so long and so completely that her silence had become part of the texture of the room, said something very quiet and direct, something about her son, something about the 2 years he had not seen the ex-girlfriend, something about the kind of person he had always been. She said it without raising her voice, without any sharpness, the way a person states a thing they have known for a long time and no longer feel any need to prove, and it landed in the room in that same quiet way, and no one disputed it. The ex-girlfriend's mother pressed her handkerchief to her eyes again, and this time the tears that came seemed different from the earlier ones, seemed less certain of their direction, less certain of what they were mourning, and she made a small sound that was not quite an apology but carried the weight of one. The brother, the ex-girlfriend's brother, uncrossed his arms, finally, and set his hands in his lap, and the gesture was so small and so unannounced that it might have gone unnoticed, but the young man saw it, and understood it for what it was, a small lowering of something that had been held up for a long time. A kind of accounting was beginning, slow and unglamorous, the way most real accountings are, not sudden and not dramatic, not the kind that produces revelations or speeches or the particular relief of a story resolving cleanly, but the kind that produces a room that has become, very gradually, quieter than it was an hour ago. The young man said, and he meant it as simply as he said it, that he did not think anyone in this room was a bad person, that he thought they had all found themselves inside a very confusing situation, and that he was not entirely sure what had led his former girlfriend to say the things she had said, but that he hoped she was all right, and he meant that too. This was met with another silence, but a silence that felt different again, thinner than before, less like a barrier and more like a pause between one state of things and the next, the kind of pause that precedes a slow and tentative movement forward. Outside, the night had settled fully over the neighborhood, the kind of settled darkness that belongs to residential streets in the middle of the week, when most of the lights in most of the houses have been turned down to their evening level and the sounds from outside are sparse and unhurried and carry no particular urgency. The young man could hear, distantly, the sound of something dripping somewhere in the house, a faucet that had not been fully closed or a gutter still moving the day's earlier rain through its channel, something small and steady and entirely indifferent to the room. His face had stopped producing the kind of blood that needed the towel, and the towel sat in his hand now, folded over itself, no longer being pressed against anything, simply held, the way one holds something without thinking because one's hands need somewhere to rest. He thought about the clinic report the mother had mentioned, the doctor's confirmation of 3 months, and he thought about how dates work, and how a 3-month timeline does not compress or expand to accommodate a story that needs it to, that numbers are sometimes the most patient things in a room full of people who are not. He did not say this aloud, because there was no need to, because the brother's quiet words had already begun to do the work of saying it, and because the room had already begun to hear it in that slow and involuntary way that rooms hear things when the people inside them have stopped arguing and started listening. The ex-girlfriend's father asked, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier certainty, what the young man's brother could tell them about that specific evening, and the young man's brother answered in a measured and unhurried way, describing where they had been and what they had done with the quiet precision of someone who was not manufacturing a story but simply remembering one. As the brother spoke, the young man looked at his own hands, at the dried edges of what the towel had caught, and he felt a long and slow exhale move through him, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, a loosening of something that had been held very tight for the past hour or more. He was tired in a way that went past the ordinary, tired in the way of someone who has been asked to hold a great many things in the front of their mind at once under circumstances not designed for clear thinking, and who has somehow, despite all of that, managed to keep their thoughts in their proper order. He was also aware, beneath the tiredness, of something he recognized only slowly, which was gratitude, not for the evening or for any of what it had contained, but for the smaller and simpler thing of his brother being in the room, of not having faced this particular hour entirely alone. The ex-girlfriend's mother had stopped crying, and her expression had moved into something more subdued, something that might have been described as chastened, though it was too early and too layered to say exactly what she was feeling, because feelings in rooms like this one do not arrange themselves neatly or on anyone's schedule. The father put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then he said something to his wife in a low voice that the young man did not try to hear, and she nodded once, very slightly, and looked at the floor. These were the small signs of something shifting, the unobtrusive grammar of a situation that was changing direction, not with any fanfare, not with the kind of clear moment that one might later describe as a turning point, but simply changing, the way water changes when the temperature drops, by degrees, and then all at once. The young man said, because it seemed like the moment for it, that he thought perhaps they should figure out together what the next steps were, that there were clearly things that needed to be understood more fully, and that he was willing to be part of that process, though he would also need to see someone about his face, and he said this last part without any reproach in his voice, simply as a statement of physical fact. The ex-girlfriend's brother looked at him when he said this, really looked at him, for the first time since the towel had been passed across the room, and what was in his face was something that was not quite guilt and not quite recognition but lived somewhere between the two, the expression of a person who has just begun to understand that the shape of a situation may be different from what they assumed when they entered it. The young man met his gaze and held it for a moment and then looked away, not in anger but in the simple recognition that some moments do not need to be prolonged, that some things are better left to settle on their own without anyone pressing on them. His mother stood, quietly, and went to the kitchen, and the sound of water running came from that direction, and then the sound of the kettle being filled, and then the low hum of it beginning to heat, and these were such familiar sounds that several people in the room seemed to relax slightly at the hearing of them, because familiar sounds in a tense room are a kind of reminder that the ordinary world is still very close by. Tea, when it came, was placed without ceremony on the low table, several cups, plain ceramic, ordinary, the kind of cups that have been washed 100 times and will be washed 100 more, and no one made a speech about it, and everyone accepted a cup, because that is what one does. The ex-girlfriend's mother held her cup in both hands and looked into it, and the young man thought, watching her, that she was perhaps beginning the long and difficult work of understanding that her daughter had told her something that was not true, and that this understanding, once it arrived fully, would be one of the harder things she would carry. He did not envy her this. He found himself thinking of his former girlfriend not as she had been described in this room by others, but as she had been during the time they were together, a person he had known well enough to know that she was not entirely simple, that she had her own fears and her own interior distances, that she had occasionally done things he did not fully understand even while he understood that she was doing them. He did not know what had happened in the 2 years since they had separated, did not know what her life had become or what circumstances had led her to the story that had brought her family to this house, and he understood that he might never know, that the inside of another person's life is not always available for inspection, no matter how urgently one needs to see it. What he knew was what he had always known, which was his own account of his own days, the ordinary and unremarkable texture of his own life, the places he had been and the people he had been with, and this knowledge was not dramatic or particularly interesting, but it was real, and it was his, and no amount of confusion in this room could change it. The tea cooled slowly in the cups, and the room continued its gradual settling, and outside the night held its ordinary quiet over the neighborhood, and the dripping sound continued somewhere in the house, small and indifferent and almost, by now, a kind of company. The ex-girlfriend's father said something about needing to speak with his daughter, that there were things that needed to be clarified, that he understood the situation might be more complicated than he had believed when he arrived, and he said this in a voice that was much quieter than the voice he had used earlier, the voice of a man who was tired and who was being honest about his tiredness. The young man said that he thought that was a good idea, and he meant it, and then the room was quiet again for a while, and this quiet was of a different order than any of the previous quiets, softer, without the charge of things about to happen, simply quiet in the way a room is quiet when the people inside it have, for the moment, run out of things to say. His brother poured a little more water into one of the cups without any ceremony, and his mother returned from the kitchen and sat down again in her original place, and the evening, which had been so many things over the past hours, was now being very slowly and very carefully folded into something that could be carried out of the room without anyone being harmed further by it. It was not resolution, not exactly, because there were still things that did not have answers, still questions that the night had produced and that the night itself could not answer, still the matter of a woman somewhere, in another part of the city, who had told a story, and whose reasons for telling it remained in the dark where she had placed them. But the room had come to a kind of resting place, a landing, and that was perhaps what was possible for now, and possible for now had a kind of dignity of its own, a kind of sufficiency that the young man, sitting quietly with his cup of tea, was beginning to recognize. He sat with the warmth of the cup moving through his palms, and let his mind do what minds do when they have been asked too much for too long, which is to slow down, to soften its edges, to release the precise accounting it had been performing and simply exist in the room without needing the room to be anything other than what it was. The amber light lay still across the tatami, and the cups on the low table held their cooling tea, and the people in the room breathed in the ordinary way that people breathe when the worst of something has passed, not with relief that announces itself but with the quieter, slower relief of a body remembering that it is allowed to rest. And in that resting, in that dim and settling room with its familiar sounds and its ordinary objects, something that had been wound very tightly for a long and exhausting hour was beginning, at last, to unwind, thread by thread, as slowly and as naturally as the night moves toward its deepest and most noiseless hour. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests, in that room, in that evening, in the quiet that arrived without anyone quite deciding to invite it, in the way that quiet so often does. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a half-remembered dream fades when morning has not yet come, gently, without resistance, dissolving back into the quiet. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one now. Let your breath move slowly, in and then out, the way a tide retreats from a shore it has always known. Feel the weight of the night settle around you, soft and unhurried. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a place where warmth lingers even after the person has gone, the way sunlight stays in a wooden floor long after the window has gone dark. Rest easy. We will find our way there together. She had written the message late in the night, in those small hours when the silence of a city apartment feels more complete than any silence that happens during daylight, when the familiar sounds around her, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint settling of the building's walls, seemed not to comfort but to deepen the particular loneliness she had been carrying now for several years. She was sitting at her desk with the small lamp on, the screen glowing softly in front of her, and somewhere nearby, on the edge of the desk as was his habit, sat Gorgonzola, her cockatiel, a pale and patient bird whose name had been chosen by her sister for reasons none of them could now quite remember. She had opened the forum because she needed somewhere to put the feeling, the kind of feeling that is too large and too shapeless to carry alone, that requires the presence of other people even if those people are strangers, even if their attention is temporary and their response is not always what one would choose to hear. What she typed was simple, a few short lines, sent into the night, explaining that she wanted to find her way back to a person she had once been married to, a man she had left and then missed and then seen, without any preparation, on an ordinary afternoon at a shopping center in the city. She sent the message and waited, and while she waited, the night moved around her in its slow and settled way, and Gorgonzola regarded the glowing screen with the mild and unconcerned attention that birds bring to all human affairs without exception. The replies came in the way they always do in those long, winding forums where strangers gather to speak freely about one another's lives, first a handful of questions, then more, the conversation widening and gaining momentum as the evening wore on and more voices joined without ceremony, from across the city and perhaps beyond it. Some of the early responses were curious rather than critical, asking her to explain herself more fully, asking her to say something about the shape of the marriage and the circumstances under which it had ended, and she obliged them with the patience of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity to tell a story she has been carrying alone for too long. The marriage had ended, she explained, as marriages sometimes do, not in a single dramatic moment but in the slow accumulation of small frictions and unmet expectations, a wearing down that had eventually arrived at a decision she had called incompatibility and that she had, at the time, believed was the only reasonable conclusion available to her. Her former husband had been a particular kind of man, attentive to the small textures of domestic life in ways that had both touched her and, she admitted, frequently annoyed her, a man who prepared meals without being asked, who attended to the laundry at times she had not specified, who came into the kitchen whether or not he had been invited, who brought to their shared home a quiet and unhurried care that she had not always known how to receive. She had wanted something she could not fully name even now. Years later, a different arrangement, perhaps, a different sense of who was responsible for what, some alignment between her life as it was actually lived and the image she had long carried of what a marriage should look like, an image absorbed from somewhere early in her life and never very carefully examined. The friction between her image and the actual texture of their shared days had grown, gradually, into something neither of them had found a way to resolve, and one day it had become a divorce, arrived at with the particular mixture of exhaustion and relief that marks the endings of things we are not entirely sure we wanted to end. And then the years had passed, the way years pass when we are paying attention to other things, her work, her apartment, the slow and comfortable rhythm of a life lived largely on its own terms, punctuated pleasantly by her sister and more insistently, with the gentle and unrelenting hope that mothers never quite relinquish, by her mother. The cockatiel had arrived into this life sometime after the divorce, a small warm presence that occupied the desk in the evenings, that accompanied the quiet weekend hours with his particular combination of brightness and tranquility, and she had accepted the improbable name her sister had offered for him and loved him with the uncomplicated affection one feels for creatures whose needs are simple and whose company asks nothing difficult in return. The years of that life had not been unhappy, she would have said if asked, but they had been quiet in a way that sometimes, on certain kinds of evenings, became something less comfortable than quiet, a stillness with a slight hollow quality, a sense that the rooms held more space than they required, that the hours stretched in ways they had not stretched when there was someone else in the apartment to fill them. And then one afternoon she had gone to a shopping center, the kind of large, well-lit, entirely ordinary place where any given day might find a dozen of the city's residents moving through their various errands, and she had turned a corner, or looked up from something she was carrying, or simply arrived at the right angle at the right moment, and there he was. He was with a woman she had not seen before, tall, composed, fair, moving through the shopping center with the particular ease of someone entirely at home in where they are, and beside them, holding that woman's hand with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt the world's safety, was a small girl with soft dark hair. He had not seen her, she was fairly certain of that, and for a moment she had simply stood in the middle of the ordinary afternoon and watched this small family assembled under the gentle fluorescent light, and something in her chest had arranged itself into a new and uncomfortable shape that she would carry home with her on the train and into the days that followed. In the forum, when she described this encounter, she reached for words carefully, the way people reach for words when they are aware, at some level, that the story they are telling says something about them they would prefer not to examine too directly. She spoke of being troubled, of being unable to settle, of feeling that something had been altered in her world without her knowledge or permission. The strangers in the forum listened to this, and then, in the way that forums do, they began to ask the questions she had not wanted to be asked, direct questions, plainly worded, about who had made the decision to end the marriage, about what it meant to feel owed a permission that had never been negotiated, about what exactly she hoped to accomplish by wanting back something she had herself set down. One voice in the thread pointed out, not without a certain precision that left little room for misunderstanding, that the man in the shopping center had not wronged her by building a life in the years since their divorce, that he had simply done what people do when they have been given time and freedom and the ordinary human capacity for starting again. She had not thought about it in quite those terms, and the observation arrived in the thread with a weight that the other readers seemed to feel. The conversation paused briefly, as conversations do when something lands squarely enough to require a moment's absorption, and then it continued. She wrote back that she understood all of this, in a theoretical way, but that understanding and accepting were different operations, and that what she felt when she thought of him was not the kind of thing that reason alone could reach. This was true, and the forum seemed to recognize it as true, and there was in the responses that followed a slight shift in tone, less sharp, more patient, the kind of shift that happens in long conversations when people decide, without quite saying so, that the person they are speaking with is not performing difficulty but actually experiencing it. But the forum also held something else, a collective insistence on returning her attention to certain facts that she kept trying to move past without quite facing, that the woman she had seen in the shopping center was a person with her own life and her own claim on things, that the child was innocent of every complexity, that the man had made his choices freely and contentedly and did not require rescuing from them. She did not want to agree with this, and she said so, and the thread continued to wind through the evening, accumulating its layers of opinion and argument and occasional warmth, and somewhere in the middle of all of it she made the decision to do what she had been considering since the afternoon she had first seen him at the shopping center. She had gone to the family home, the house of his parents, a place she had known well during the years of the marriage, a house that held the particular texture of familiarity that old houses acquire when people have spent enough years in and around them. What happened at the door of that house she described to the forum with a selectiveness that the forum, reading between lines, decoded fairly quickly an encounter that had escalated in the way that encounters do when the feeling that sends a person out into the afternoon is still very much present and making decisions on their behalf. The woman who answered had been composed in the face of an unexpected arrival, and she had not been welcoming, and the words exchanged at the door had not been measured ones, and the afternoon had ended in a manner that neither woman, in a calmer moment, would have chosen. She had come away from the encounter with an injury, her right knee, her right arm, bruised in the particular way that such confrontations sometimes produce, and she had gone home and sat with the injury and with the feelings that had preceded it and tried to understand what any of it had actually accomplished. Not very much, she found. She told the forum this. The forum was not surprised. The evidence of her injury she shared in a photograph, and the forum examined it with the forensic skepticism that such places apply to all photographs, and they were not convinced by it, and she insisted it was genuine, and they remained unconvinced, and for a while the thread turned in circles around this point without making much progress. There were voices in the forum that she found difficult, voices that were blunter than she would have liked, that said things she had not been prepared to hear, and there were also voices that were gentler, that seemed to understand something of what she was feeling beneath the surface of the story she was telling. One of the gentler voices said that what sounded like righteous certainty on the surface was, if you listened to it carefully, something much more familiar and much more ordinary, a person who missed someone they had lost, who was dealing with that missing in a way that had not served her well, and who was perhaps not quite ready to admit how straightforward the situation actually was. She read this and said nothing for a while, and the forum filled the silence with its usual hum of smaller conversations, and Gorgonzola, in the apartment where she sat reading, attended to whatever small bird business occupied him in the late evening when the room was quiet and the lamp was the only light. Then there was the phone call to the family home, because his own number had been changed and she did not have the new one, and his mother had answered, and the conversation that followed had been the kind that is difficult on both sides, where the person speaking and the person listening are both aware that something important is being said but that neither of them has quite chosen the circumstances. His mother spoke with a measured sadness. She described to the forum afterward the sadness of a woman who loves her son and has watched him navigate difficulty and arrive somewhere good, and who does not want the good place disturbed by the return of old complications. She said, in the way that people say the most necessary things when they have decided to be both kind and clear, that her son was settled, that his wife was a woman of genuine grace, that their daughter was a joy to everyone in the family, and that the household they had built together was not a mistake or a consolation prize but the real thing, built with care over the years since the divorce. And she said it without anger, which made it more effective than anger would have been. The way the quietest statements are often the ones that carry the most weight, precisely because they leave no room for the listener to push back against a tone rather than attending to a meaning. She had sat afterward in the kitchen, perhaps with the small sound of the kettle somewhere in the room, that particular domestic punctuation that marks the end of an active part of the day and the beginning of the quieter part, and she had stayed with what had been said for longer than she usually stayed with anything. She returned to the forum and told them about the call, and the forum received it with a degree of gentleness it had not always displayed in the earlier hours of the evening. There is something about the weight of a mother's voice, even reported at a distance, that softens the sharpest thread. Someone made a comment about Gorgonzola, about the particular comedy of a cockatiel named after an Italian cheese, and she found herself responding to this with something that was, if not quite laughter, then at least the kind of warmth that is adjacent to it, explaining about her sister, about the arbitrariness of the name, about how he did not seem to have been damaged by it in any measurable way. The thread had adopted the bird as a kind of mascot, referring to him by the affectionate shortened form that Japanese conversation often arrives at when it has decided something deserves to be kept close, Goru-chan, with a diminutive that carries warmth without quite meaning to be formal about it, and this small adoption had changed the atmosphere of the thread in ways she had not anticipated. The bird had been present through all of it, through the typing and the waiting and the reading and the rereading, through the moments when the replies were difficult and the moments when they were less so, through the whole long and tangled evening, simply sitting on the edge of the desk and watching the screen with the patient equanimity that birds maintain regardless of what the people around them are going through. And then his actual call came, not through the family home this time, but to her directly, from a number she did not recognize until she heard the voice, and then she recognized it completely, the way we recognize things that have been absent long enough to become surprising but not long enough to become unfamiliar. He spoke calmly, she told the forum afterward, in the way of a person who has worked through the difficulty of a situation and arrived somewhere that is genuinely settled rather than performed, not distant, not cold, not dramatizing a forgiveness or a farewell, simply speaking to her as a person he had once known and still, in whatever quiet way, wished well. He said that he was happy. He said it plainly, without elaboration. He said that his wife was someone he loved, and that his daughter was the center of his days, and that he hoped she would find what she was looking for, and the completeness of it, the way it was said without any opening left for revision or argument, the way it was simply a statement of where things stood, reached her in a way that the forum's most precise observations had only partially managed. She sat for a long time after that call ended, in the familiar geography of her apartment, with the city's evening sounds moving softly through the window glass and the lamp casting its ordinary warm circle, and Gorgonzola watching from the desk edge in the calm and impartial way of birds who have witnessed everything and judged nothing. She went back to the thread one final time, and she said that she was going to look forward now, and she said it the way people say things that have already been decided, somewhere quieter than the place where words form, the words arriving slightly behind the decision they describe, catching up to something the body had already understood. The forum received this with a warmth she had not expected from a group that had been, at various points in the evening, quite blunt with her. There was something in the responses that felt like the particular relief of people who have been hoping for a specific outcome and are glad when it arrives. Someone said that 36 was early, not late, that the kind of life she was imagining for herself was still fully available, that the thing she wanted was a thing the future could provide if she was willing to face it without the complication of the past. She read this and did not disagree. Her mother had been calling. Several calls, unreturned, each one gently reiterating the same suggestion about her friend's son, a name she had been reflexively deflecting for longer than she could now quite justify. Sitting in the lamplight of that late evening, with everything that had been said and heard and felt beginning to settle around her into something more like stillness than turbulence, she found herself thinking that perhaps tomorrow she would call back, would listen to the name, would at least allow the possibility to be named before deciding it was impossible. It was the smallest movement available, a willingness to hear a name, nothing more, but in the quiet of the late hour, after the long and clarifying evening the forum had given her, it felt like enough to be going on with. Later, in the other room, the futon would be spread on the floor in the way that futons are spread on evenings when the day has been long and the body has finally arrived at the hour of its own willingness to rest, the folded cotton warm from the room, carrying the particular density of comfort that belongs to things one has slept beneath many hundreds of times. She would have moved through the small rituals of the end of an evening. Gorgonzola returned to his cage with the unhurried ceremony that closes each of their shared days. The lamp turned to its lower setting, the sounds of the city outside settling into the particular register of late Tokyo, the softer traffic, the faint suggestion of the last trains on their routes, the hush that descends when the day's commerce is mostly finished. It might have been raining by then, the soft and uncommitted rain that comes to the city in the spring months, a mist more than a proper rain, blurring the lights of the city into reflections on wet pavement, making the streets below look slightly more like an impression of a city than the city itself. And she would have lain in the familiar weight of the futon and looked at the ceiling in the dim room and thought, with less urgency than she had felt for several weeks, about the evening that had passed. She thought about him, not the idealized figure she had assembled in the years since the divorce, not the man of the shopping center afternoon with his easy posture and his small and beautiful family, but the actual man she had been married to, the one who had come into the kitchen without being asked, who had been patient in ways she had not always appreciated, who had left the door of himself open long after she had begun to close her own. She thought about how easy it is to confuse familiarity with dissatisfaction, How the things most persistently present in a life are also the things most easily overlooked, most readily wished away, and then, once they are gone, most precisely missed, with a tenderness that was rarely directed toward them while they were still near. She thought about the small girl with the dark hair, the child glimpsed through a doorway on that difficult afternoon, watching the adult situation with the particular expression of a child who understands that something is happening without understanding what, and she found herself thinking, with a gentleness that had not been available to her earlier in the week, that the child deserved none of what had arrived at her door. And she thought about the woman who had answered, not with the feeling she had carried immediately out of that encounter, but with something more like a reluctant recognition, a person who had built a life in a space that had been left open, who had answered a door to find something unexpected on the other side, and who had responded from whatever combination of instinct and circumstance governed such moments. The thinking grew less structured as the minutes passed, the thoughts becoming less like arguments and more like images, a lit interior of a shopping center, a small hand held in a larger one, the sound of a familiar voice speaking with a calm she had not expected. The rain moved through the night without urgency, barely audible through the glass, a soft and impersonal presence that fell on this apartment and on every other apartment visible from its window, on all the other quiet rooms where people were lying in their various futonas and thinking their various late-night thoughts. The thread was still there somewhere, on her phone in the other room, still technically open, the record of an evening she would return to occasionally in the coming months, not to reread it exactly, but to confirm that it had happened and that the things that had been said in it had been real. What the forum had given her was something she had not expected when she opened it that evening, not comfort in the way comfort is usually offered, not agreement or validation, but a kind of witness, a group of strangers who had stayed with the story long enough to see where it went, who had been honest enough to say the things that needed to be said even when she had met those things with resistance. There is a particular value in that kind of honest company, even when it is assembled from people who do not know you and will not remember you, the value of a mirror held steadily enough that the reflection has no choice but to clarify. And the bird, throughout all of it, had simply been present, had watched the screen glow and the lamp cast its circle and the room accumulate its evening quality, had required nothing of the night except the small and ordinary provisions of warmth and seed and an occasional word spoken softly into the quiet. The futon held her, and the room held the futon, and outside the window the city continued in the enormous and unhurried way that cities continue through the night, all its thousands of lit windows and its quiet corridors and its last trains still running on their rails, the whole vast and ordinary enterprise of other people's lives proceeding without pause. Stories like this one are, in many ways, the most ordinary kind, the kind that happens in apartment buildings in any city, in the months after the end of something that had once seemed permanent, when the mind and the heart are working out between them what the ending means and what, if anything, can follow it. What gives them their weight is not the drama, though the evening in the forum had not been entirely without drama, but the quieter thing that moved beneath it, the slow and almost imperceptible movement from holding to releasing, from the posture of someone leaning backward into a closed door to the posture of someone who has simply, at last, stepped away from it. The thread had begun with a question about return and had become, by the time it finished, the occasion for a different kind of recognition, not a return but a release, the understanding that what had been set down could remain where it was, and that this was not a loss requiring mourning but simply a fact requiring acceptance. She had looked at herself in the mirror the forum held, and she had not always recognized what she saw, had found in the reflection a person more governed by feeling and pride than the version of herself she usually carried in mind, more certain of her own narrative than the available evidence warranted. But the looking had happened, and that was the thing. She had stayed with the discomfort of it rather than closing the thread and going to bed, had let the honesty of strangers do its slow and uncomfortable work, and something in that willingness to stay was itself a kind of beginning. And Gorgonzola, named after a cheese, guardian of the desk, indifferent to all of it in the most generous possible way, had simply continued being what he was, small, warm, alive, entirely sufficient in the circle of the evening's lamplight. The city would be bright again in the morning, as the city always is after a night has passed through it, the streets clear and reflective after whatever rain had come and gone, the light fresh in the way that morning light is fresh when one has slept enough, and the bird would be awake on his perch with the patient expectation of a creature who knows that morning brings what mornings bring. She would make tea in the usual way, and move through the usual rhythms of the apartment, and the day would begin in the entirely ordinary manner in which days always begin, without ceremony, without announcement, in the quiet and undramatic way that the next thing follows the last. Her mother's name was in her phone. Her sister's. The name of a friend she had not called in some months. All of these were available. All of these were real. All of these were part of what the next season of things might contain if she was willing to let them be. Whatever came next, however the following weeks and months arranged themselves, however the new thing presented itself when it arrived, would begin in the manner that new things always begin, quietly, in the gap between one day's ending and the next day's opening, in the space made available by whatever has finally, gently, been put down. And that, perhaps, is where this story finds its rest, not in an ending that resolves every question or explains away every complexity, but in the particular stillness that follows when the last urgent feeling has done what all feelings eventually do, in their own time and past. The lamp is off now. The bird is still. The rain, if there was rain, has moved on without leaving a record of itself behind. And the night holds everything quietly, as the night always does, until the morning comes. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it grow quiet and distant, like a house settling after a long day. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath come slowly, and feel the weight of your body resting where it is, heavy and still and safe. The night is patient with you. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, where the rooms are small and familiar, where the sounds are ordinary ones, a clock, a window, the soft creak of floors that have known many years of footsteps. You can simply listen, or let your eyes grow heavy and allow the words to drift past you like water. Either way, there is nothing you need to do. He consulted a lawyer, quietly, and was told that the choice of an unusual name, however extreme, was not the kind of thing the law addressed directly, and that questions of custody, should it come to that, would be decided on a far wider range of considerations than a name alone. His own parents, when he told them the name, were silent for a long and uncomfortable interval, and he asked them not to raise the subject with his wife directly, knowing that additional pressure from outside would likely make her position more fixed rather than less, and they honored that request, though the worry did not leave their expressions when he saw them. He sent her messages in the days that followed, proposing names that shared something of the quality she was looking for while remaining within a range a person could carry more easily through the world, names from other beloved stories, modern names with a kind of strength that did not tip over into impossibility. She replied that none of them were right, that they were too ordinary, that a stranger hearing them would not recognize what she had intended, and that the point of the name was precisely the name and nothing else could replace it. He put down his phone and sat in the quiet of the apartment and understood, in the way one understands things when the arguing has gone on long enough, that they were no longer really having a disagreement about a name. Something deeper had become visible behind the particular word they had been circling, some difference in how they each understood the child who was coming and perhaps how they had been seeing each other across the whole length of their marriage, and the name had simply been where that difference finally became clear enough to examine. The birth registration form, he learned afterward, had been submitted during her stay at her parents' home, the name entered and the document filed before he had found a moment to reopen the conversation. When he made inquiries about whether such a thing could be amended, he was told that the family court could consider a name change under certain conditions, but that the process was not simple, would take time, and would leave its own notation in the family records. He thought about it for some days. He was very tired. Then something arrived that none of the arguments had anticipated, entering the story with no announcement, the way the most significant things often do. The birth had been by caesarean section, as it had always been planned, and in the hours that followed there had been difficulties, and she had not been well, and the child had spent additional days in the care of the hospital before anyone was able to bring him home. The boy had been born with Down syndrome, a condition that changes the shape of what a family imagines for itself, gently and irreversibly, asking for a different kind of patience and a different kind of love than the one anyone had been practicing. She wrote about what followed on a different forum, writing as a new mother recently home from the hospital, facing a rearranged future, asking whether there was a way to reach her estranged husband that he might still be willing to hear. She said she wanted to try again, that she understood she had made decisions she could not undo, that she had said and done things she regretted, and that if there was a path back toward the life she had been building, she wanted to find it. The people who read what she wrote said things in return that were not always easy to receive, because the shape of the situation she described made certain of her own choices quite visible, and those who read it were not inclined to overlook them. They noted that she had been the one to file the papers, that she had given the hospital a false reason to prevent her husband from being present when the child was born, and that these things could not simply be set aside because the circumstances had since changed. She acknowledged this in her later replies, and those replies were quieter in tone than her earlier ones, and she said only that she knew what she had done, and that she did not know how to undo it, and that her regret was real even if it had arrived too late to change the shape of things. He learned what he could about the child through the people who still move between both sides of the situation, the informal network that forms around a family in separation, carrying news that would not otherwise travel. The boy was home. He was being looked after. Her mother came each day. He had wanted for a long time to be a father, had thought about it through all the difficult months of treatment, had allowed himself to imagine the quiet ordinary details of it, the weight of a small person carried up the stairs in the evening, the sound of a child sleeping in the next room, the particular slowness of a Sunday morning at home. What would come next between the people in this story was not yet clear, and perhaps could not be, not from where any of them stood. There would be conversations that had not yet taken place, and forms to complete, and perhaps the measured proceedings of a family court, and eventually something would settle into the shape it would hold, even if that shape resembled nothing anyone had originally imagined. The boy would grow, steadily and at his own pace, without much understanding of the adult arrangements unfolding around him. He would learn to move through rooms and to recognize faces and to speak words and to find his way into the world at whatever pace the world and his own nature offered him, and one day someone would say his name in a doorway or across a table, and he would look up the way any child does, because it was his name, the only one he had ever had, already woven into everything he knew about himself. Whether it would sit strangely in a classroom or settle over time into something simply and entirely his, whether the children around him would think much about it or find other things more interesting to think about, none of this could be known from where anyone stood in that early autumn. His father had written, somewhere in those forum posts, about his own family name, the long and elaborate old-fashioned name he had carried all his life, the name people stumbled over and looked at twice before attempting to say aloud. He had described the slow process of growing into that name, of becoming someone whose life was larger than the small reactions it sometimes produced, of understanding eventually that a name is only the first thing a stranger knows about you, and that everything which comes after renders it small by comparison. Perhaps what he had been reaching toward, underneath all the argument and the long exhaustion of those summer months, was not a particular name but a belief that his son would one day be more than whatever had been given to him before he could choose, that a life a person builds always outgrows the labels attached to it at the very beginning. And that was not something any forum could settle, or any lawyer, or any quiet conversation at a table with cooling tea between two people who had stopped finding their way toward each other somewhere along the road. The autumn rain came gently that year to the part of the city where each of them now lived separately, pooling in the small hollows of the pavement, settling across awnings, tapping against the windows of apartments where lights were coming on in the early evenings. Rain on a window in autumn carries a particular quality, soft and steady, like the sound of something being slowly and carefully set down. And the story rested there, in that kind of quiet, in the way that stories about real people in the middle of real lives are always resting somewhere, unfinished, still moving, still finding the shape they will eventually take. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a half-remembered dream dissolves in the first pale light of morning. There is no hurry now. If you would like, draw in a slow breath, hold it gently, and let it go. The night is still around you, and you have nowhere at all to be. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a place of low lamplight and the distant sound of rain against a windowsill, where the hours move the way water moves through still reeds, unhurried, without weight. Rest here a moment longer, if you wish. The space between stories belongs entirely to you. When the Gold Award was announced, Miu rose from her seat before anyone around her, and the mother noticed that her hands were not quite steady and that her face was engaged in the effort not to cry, an effort that was not winning. She said that Nozomi had deserved it, that it was because of Nozomi, and her voice had the quality of something said because it was simply and exactly true, with no effort toward impression. Nozomi emerged from backstage flushed with the warmth of performance and put her arm around Miyu's shoulders and said something close to her ear, and Miu nodded and composed herself, and they walked out into the autumn afternoon together. It was the kind of moment that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone passing, just two young women in the lobby of a regional concert hall, one with a golden ribbon on her music case, and yet the mother held it carefully, knowing she would return to it. 2 years later, when Nozomi had moved to high school and Miu entered middle school, Miu walked to the brass band room during the first week and put her name beside the word flute, and the mother, when she heard, felt something that was more like recognition than surprise. She practiced with the same steadiness her sister had shown, arriving early, staying late, learning the discipline of making a sound that serves the music rather than displays itself, and by her third year she too had been chosen by her fellow members as club president. The year Miu led the club they competed and did not win the gold, and she came home with a quietness that carried more weight than usual, and the mother made tea and sat beside her at the kitchen table without pressing for words. The father came in later and placed his hand briefly on Miu's shoulder, and Miu looked at the steam rising from her cup, and after some time the weight in her quiet began to ease, and the evening settled around them the way evenings do when people are at ease in one another's silence. Because what the mother felt in that kitchen was not disappointment, there was no disappointment in her, none, but something fuller and harder to name, having to do with looking at this quiet and capable young woman and understanding all the distance she had traveled to arrive at this particular chair, in this kitchen, in this home. She had come to them unable to meet an adult's eyes, unable to use chopsticks, unable to trust that warmth offered to her would remain, and she had become someone who stood before others and led them, who was looked to and trusted, and the kitchen where she now sat quietly was genuinely hers. The high school years moved at their own pace, full and internally busy, with the quality of something important that is also, always, a form of preparation for what comes after, and the mother kept close to the perimeter of those years without pressing into the interior, which was as it should be. Nozomi grew into the fullest version of what had always been there, warm and capable and instinctively generous, the kind of person that others organize themselves around without being quite able to say how or why. Miu grew differently, with more deliberateness, adding each new layer of herself carefully, as if making certain the foundation was solid before building on it, and the result was someone of unusual depth and steadiness, the kind of depth only visible to those who have known someone long enough to understand what it cost to become this. She smiled readily now, had opinions she was willing to state, and would sometimes challenge the father on matters of fact in the mild and tolerant manner of a grown child who has learned that her parents are not infallible, and the father received this with cheerful good humor. The mother watched both daughters in those later years and thought sometimes about what she could only call the arithmetic of love, how it does not divide when shared among more than one person but somehow multiplies, so that there was more warmth in the house now than there had been before Miu came to it. Both girls finished school and began their working lives, and the household absorbed these changes as it had absorbed all the others, without drama, with patience, and the mother found that the house had a quality now of something built carefully and solidly, something that could hold whatever the years sent through it. Nozomi had been in a relationship for some time with a man she had met at work, a quiet and reliable person, the kind the mother had trusted from their first meeting, and plans had been made, and there would be a wedding. And Miu, around the same season, had accepted a position with a company at a distance that made commuting from home impractical, and she had decided to find a small apartment of her own, the first place that would be entirely hers, and to begin the particular venture of a life lived in one's own space. The mother had held these two pieces of news quietly for a few days before they settled, understanding that this was the form completion was going to take, not an ending in any grieving sense, but the completion of something built slowly and with care, now at last whole. She was 60 years old, and both her daughters were moving forward into the full weight of their own lives, and the evenings in the house had begun to carry a new kind of quiet, not an empty quiet, but the quiet of a room that holds within it everything that has ever happened there, gently, without display. She had written all of this down, she said, because it seemed worth recording that a family is not something one simply has but something one builds, through the daily accumulation of lunches made and teas poured and homework sat beside and small shoulders leaning into familiar arms, and that this kind of building never quite announces itself while it is happening. And that, she felt, was where the story could rest for this evening, not at an end, but in the long and quiet fullness of an ordinary life, a life made extraordinary only by the love that had moved through it steadily, without interruption, from the very beginning to now. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way all shadows do when you stop looking at them. You have listened well, and perhaps your breath has already grown a little slower, a little deeper, without you even noticing. There is no hurry here. Let your shoulders settle further into whatever is holding you, and feel the quiet gathering around you like something soft and familiar. Our next story takes us to a quieter household, a place of small rooms and gentle routines, where the hours move like water over smooth stone. But before we arrive there, rest a moment in this stillness. Breathe slowly. You are safe, and the night is long, and there is nowhere else you need to be. Somewhere in the slow middle of November, when the light in late afternoon falls low and sideways through paper screens, and the smell of the tatami is cool and faintly green beneath the warmer scent of tea things being set out in the next room, a young man sat with a kind of stillness that was not entirely his own. He had received the news some weeks earlier, delivered in a small, unremarkable office by a doctor whose voice had been gentle in the way that voices become gentle when they are carrying something heavy, and he had walked out of the building into an ordinary afternoon that had looked exactly the same as it had when he walked in. What had been said to him, the words that meant months rather than years, a horizon drawn nearer than he had imagined, were still something he had not shared with his mother, or with his father, or with his younger sister, who sometimes sent him small, cheerful messages in the evenings about nothing in particular. He had moved through the weeks since then with the sensation of carrying something both fragile and very large, something that occupied the space beside him wherever he went, silent and present, like a second shadow falling in a direction the light had not come from. On the morning he decided to visit his grandmother, he had not planned to say anything meaningful, and he had told himself, gently, that it would simply be a visit, the ordinary kind, with tea and the small talk that families make when they sit together in rooms that have held them for many years. His grandmother lived in the house where his mother had grown up, a low wooden house on a narrow street in a part of the city that had not changed very much in 40 years, where the electricity wires strung between poles still hummed faintly in any kind of wind, and the neighborhood cat slept on the low stone walls in the afternoons. She was in her late 80s now, his grandmother, his oberkan, which is the soft familiar word, the word that belongs to childhood and to kitchen tables and to the particular warmth of someone who has always simply been there, and she moved through her house slowly, but with a sense of purpose that had not diminished. He arrived in the early afternoon, when the light was still coming through the side windows, and she met him at the door with the expression she always wore when she saw him, that quiet pleasure of seeing someone she had known since before they knew themselves. They settled in the main room, the one with the low table and the cushions worn soft from years of use, and she brought tea in the small pot she had always used, the one with the pale blue glaze that had a small chip on its lid from some accident long ago that no one could quite remember anymore. For a while they talked about the ordinary things, the weather turning, the neighbor whose garden had been looking particularly well this year, a television program she had been watching in the evenings, a letter received from a relative in another prefecture. He listened, and he nodded, and he held his cup in both hands the way she had taught him when he was very small, and he felt the particular warmth of sitting in a room that had remained itself across decades, unchanged in the ways that mattered, the smell of the wood, the weight of the quiet, the sound of the street coming in muffled and distant from outside. His grandmother, he noticed, seemed to be moving a little more slowly than the last time he had visited, and there was something in the deliberate way she lowered herself onto her cushion that told him she was paying careful attention to her body in the way that people do when they have begun, quietly and without drama, to keep account of what it can and cannot do. She asked him how he had been, in the simple way she always asked, and he said that he had been well, which was not entirely true, but which was the answer that belonged to the ordinary shape of the visit he had intended to have. She nodded, and then she was quiet for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, and he had the sense that she was about to say something she had already been thinking about before he arrived, something that had been sitting with her in the way certain thoughts sit with a person and wait for the right moment to be spoken. She said, slowly and without particular heaviness, that she had been thinking lately about her age, and about how the years had arranged themselves behind her into a very long and, she thought, a very full row, and she said that she was not frightened exactly, but that she had noticed herself growing more attentive to the small things, the feel of the morning, the color of light on the paper screen, the sound of the kettle beginning to heat. He listened to her carefully and held very still, because something in the way she was speaking moved through him with a warmth that was also, somehow, an ache. She said that she had lived long enough to understand that everything, every season, every conversation, every particular quality of afternoon light on a particular day, came only once, and that this had seemed like a sad thing when she was younger but had come to seem, in recent years, more like a gift, because it meant that nothing was wasted. She said that her own mother had told her something similar, a long time ago, in a room not entirely different from this one, and that she had not understood it then but had kept it with her, the way one keeps a stone in a pocket, feeling the weight of it without always knowing why. He sat across from her, and the afternoon went on, and the shadow of the window frame moved very slowly across the tatami in the way shadows move when the sun is low and the movement of the earth is, for a moment, almost visible. He found himself thinking that she did not know what he knew, and that she was speaking to him from one side of a similar understanding, the understanding that one's time is finite and that this finitude is real and near and ordinary, and that here they were, the two of them, on their separate sides of that same quiet fact. She said that she had been sorting through some of her things recently, not in a hurried way but slowly, going through old photographs and certain pieces of cloth and small objects that had accumulated over the decades, and she said that what had struck her was how much of what she thought she had forgotten had come back simply by touching things. She said there was a photograph from the summer she was 23 that she had not looked at in perhaps 30 years, and that when she found it, everything about that summer, the particular smell of the sea, the weight of her hair in the heat, the face of someone she had loved briefly and well, had returned to her completely, as if the photograph had been holding it all in trust. She smiled when she said this, a small private smile, the kind that belongs entirely to the person wearing it and does not require any response from anyone else. He did not speak for a moment, and the room held them both in its familiar quiet, and outside a bicycle passed on the street with a small metallic sound, and then the street was quiet again. He thought about the things he had not said, to his mother, to his father, to his sister with her cheerful evening messages, and he thought about the weight of carrying those unsaid things, and whether the carrying was a kindness or whether it was something else, something lonelier. His grandmother refilled his cup without asking, which was the way she had always done it, and the sound of the tea pouring was the same sound it had always been, and he felt, very quietly, as if the distance between where he was now and who he had been in this room as a child was not so very far after all. She said, after a pause, that she hoped he was not working too hard, and that she had always thought he had a tendency to carry too much on his own, which was admirable in some ways but also, she added gently, a little hard on the person doing the carrying. He looked at her, and she looked back at him with the particular steadiness of someone who has lived long enough to see through the ordinary surfaces of things without making any production of it, and he felt, in that moment, a specific and quiet longing to tell her everything. He did not tell her everything. He found he could not yet, not in that room on that afternoon, and perhaps also because there was something in what she had already said that felt like a kind of telling, a different kind, one that did not require the words themselves to be spoken aloud between them. She said that she found, at her age, that the things which had seemed very large and very frightening when she was younger had a way of becoming, over time, simply part of the landscape, the way a mountain that seems enormous when you are standing at its foot becomes, in memory, just one feature of a view that also contains many other things. She said that she was not sure she had been a very wise person in her life. She offered this lightly, without self-pity, but that she had tried to pay attention, and that paying attention had been, in the end, the thing that had mattered most to her. He found that his eyes had grown warm, and that the warmth was becoming something he could not entirely contain, and he was aware of his own breathing in the way a person becomes aware of breathing when it meets something it cannot simply process and pass along. His grandmother, watching him with the calm and unhurried attention she had always given to whatever was in front of her, did not say anything for a long moment, but simply let the room be what it was. He said, eventually, that he had missed her, which was true, and she said that she had missed him too, and then neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable but rather full of something that both of them understood without needing to arrange it into words. She reached across the low table and put her hand briefly on his, the way she had always done, her hand small and very warm, the skin soft in the way that the skin of the very old becomes soft, worn smooth by decades of ordinary work and weather and the small daily business of being alive. He thought about how her hands had always seemed like the steadiest things in any room she was in, and how they still were, and how the steadiness in them was not separate from her smallness or her age but somehow woven together with both. She said, after a while, that she had been dreaming lately of her own mother and father, both of whom had been gone for many years, and she said the dreams were not sad exactly, but more like visits, like ordinary evenings spent in conversation, and that she woke from them feeling strangely settled, as if something had been resolved that she hadn't known was unresolved. She said that she thought this might be one of the small gifts of growing very old, that the people one has loved and lost begin to feel less lost, and more simply somewhere else, the way a friend who has moved to another city is still, in some sense, simply elsewhere. He held his cup and listened, and the tears that had been gathering in him came, quietly and without any particular force, the way rain sometimes arrives on an afternoon when the sky has been heavy for hours and the arrival is almost a relief. He did not try to stop them, and his grandmother did not draw attention to them, but simply continued to sit with him in the way she had always sat with him when he was a child and something had been too large to carry alone, present and warm and without any demand that he be otherwise than he was. Outside, the afternoon had begun its slow movement toward evening, and the light through the paper screen had taken on the amber quality it carries in late autumn, when the angle of the sun is low and the air holds the memory of warmth even as the warmth itself recedes. His grandmother poured a little more tea, and they sat for a while longer, speaking of small things, a recipe she had been meaning to give him, a book she had been reading in the evenings, the cherry trees in the park down the street and how they would look come spring. He found himself listening to her voice as something separate from its content, the cadence of it, the particular music of a voice that has been speaking for nearly 90 years and has settled into its own unhurried rhythm, and he thought that he wanted to remember this, the exact quality of her voice in this room on this afternoon. She said, at one point, that she had always believed the people we love become part of us in a way that is more literal than it sounds, that the shape of someone's kindness, the particular way they listen, the specific things they found funny or beautiful, these things live on inside the people who loved them and go forward and become part of whatever comes next. He turned this over carefully, the way one turns a stone in a hand, and he thought that she might be right, and that if she was right then there was something in what she was saying that made the horizon feel a little less absolute, a little less final than it had seemed in the weeks since the doctor's office. She did not know she was saying this to someone who needed to hear it in quite this particular way, and yet he sat with the sense that she had said it exactly when and how it needed to be said, which had always been true of her. When he stood to leave, the evening had settled properly into the room, and his grandmother walked him to the door slowly, and they stood for a moment in the small entryway, where his coat had hung on the same hook since he was a child, and where the smell of the house was always most concentrated: old wood, clean cloth, and something faintly of the sea from a piece of driftwood she had kept on a shelf for as long as anyone could remember. She told him to come back soon, and he told her he would, and he meant it in a way he had not always meant it when he was younger and the days had seemed abundant and the future an unexamined thing. He walked down the narrow street in the early evening, and the lights in the houses along the street were beginning to come on one after another, and the air carried the smell of something being cooked somewhere nearby, and the world, in that moment, was very present and very ordinary and very dear. He carried the afternoon's conversation the way he had been carrying the other thing, except that what he carried now felt less like a weight and more like a warmth, something placed gently in the chest by someone who had known exactly what was needed there. He thought about her hands on his, and the sound of tea pouring into a cup in the afternoon, and her voice describing the dreams in which her own parents paid her ordinary evening visits, and he found himself willing, now, to imagine something similar, a future in which he too might visit someone he loved from wherever it was one went. He thought about whether the shape of his kindness, such as it was, and the things he had found beautiful, and the particular way he listened, whether these things would live on inside the people who loved him, and go forward, as she had said, into whatever came next. It seemed to him, walking slowly through the evening streets, that it was possible they would, and the thought was gentle, and it kept him company all the way home, past the lit windows and the cooking smells and the small familiar sounds of the city settling into night. In the days that followed, he thought often about that afternoon, the quality of the light, the smell of the tea, the steadiness of her hands, and he found that the memory had become a place he could return to when the days felt heavy, a room inside himself that was warm and unhurried and still. He did not tell his family his secret for some time after that, and when he finally found the words and the moment, they came more gently than he had feared, partly because of the afternoon spent with her, and partly because of something she had shown him that day about the way things can be carried when they are not carried entirely alone. His grandmother, for her part, did not know what she had given him on that November afternoon, or if she did, she said nothing about it, only continued to live in her wooden house on the quiet street, sorting through her photographs and dreaming of her parents and watching the light change through the paper screen, as she had done every day for as long as anyone could remember. And perhaps that is the nature of certain gifts. They are offered without the giver knowing their weight, given simply because the moment called for them, and received somewhere deep inside the person who needed them, where they rest quietly, doing their work, long after the afternoon that carried them has passed. Two people had sat across a low table in a room that had held many conversations before theirs, and had spoken of ordinary things, tea and weather and photographs and dreams, and in the speaking had found, without naming it, a kind of shared understanding of what it means to live inside a body that will eventually be finished. And to love the people around you anyway. Perhaps because of it. Perhaps more tenderly, for the knowing. The tea had cooled, and the light had changed, and the afternoon had become evening, and the young man had walked home through streets that smelled of cooking and the turning season, carrying something new in the place where the heaviness had been. And the grandmother had returned to her chair by the window, and the room had settled around her in its familiar way, and the paper screen had held the last of the light as it always did, and the small sounds of the neighborhood had continued their evening rhythms, as unchanged and as steady as her hands. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests, not in any particular resolution, not in any grand arrival, but in the quiet and sufficient fact of two people sitting together in a room in November, each holding something the other did not say, and finding, in the space between the spoken and the unspoken, something that felt very much like peace. And so we come to the end of tonight's stories. The voices have grown quiet now, and the tales have settled into stillness, like leaves coming to rest after a long, slow fall.